Social crisis, war, and revolution. The objectives are: 1. Explain how the 30 Years' War ended the unity of the Holy Roman Empire. And 2, relate how democratic ideals were strengthened as a result of the English and Glorious Revolutions. Now, first beginning with the economic and social crisis. One of the greatest issues that began to emerge as a result of Spain primarily is inflation. Inflation is the principle in which an economy is flooded with that currency such that it devalues the currency, and each coin or each item of trade becomes worth less. And so we see this through the great influx of gold and silver from the Americas. This was certainly one factor, that Spain and Europe in general had a kind of fixed value of gold because there was less of it. But as gold began to spill into Europe through Spain and through the American colonies, it inevitably devalued that gold because it was less rare. So Spain's economy grew, and it definitely exploded, but it ultimately grew dependent on imported silver and imported currency from other places. And this will inevitably become a problem when the imported territories produce less. And so you see a population increase at this time as well, from 60 million in 1500 to 85 million in 1600, which requires a more bolstered and bulky economy to allow for the prosperity of all those people. Now, socially at least, there is also great tension, not just economically, but through the concepts of demonic intervention in life and in witchcraft. So the religious zeal that had led to the Inquisition, hunting out heresies, also led to the hunt for, of course, witches. And these witches were seen as those who were sympathetic toward the devil and toward the devil's work on earth. So it's argued perhaps more than 100,000 people were charged with witchcraft, and the bulk of them were burned at the stake and killed. Now, it's believed that more than 75% of those accused were women, single or widowed, and usually around the age of 50 or over. So while witches are not just women, there are male witches, and they're not just old ladies. There are young witches. The bulk seems to be older women, and usually, through at least most of the source material, women who had isolated themselves or lived in the woods, practiced traditional medicine and traditional views toward the old ideas of paganism that had kind of lingered in Europe all the way back from pre-Christian era. But these people were seen as sympathizers of the devil and doing the devil's work on earth. Now, some of the accusations that kind of emerged and were explained were that the witches swore allegiance to the devil, that they practiced Black Sabbath, that is that once in a while on a Black Sabbath, all the witches would rub themselves down with oil, and they would fly through the night to a particular meeting place in the woods, and there the devil would meet them, and that they would proceed to have sexual relations with the devil as he is in the guise of some kind of animal, a giant cat or a goat or something like that. And that they would practice evil spells and curses on people. Now, part of this issue is that the culture itself believes that all of the natural phenomena occurring in the world that seems dangerous and disastrous was the result of evil spirits. So if there was a massive plague, it was the result of evil spirits. If there was a massive earthquake, it was the result of some evil spirit. And so you could see that if something is going wrong in a community, they might turn immediately to witches and be searching for witches, which led to a great number of witch trials and a witchcraft hysteria where people are knocking down doors and accusing each other of witchcraft which really would just look like any one person doing anything that seemed odd or different. So this is also a religious context that is kind of a tumultuous portion of the time. But we also have warfare during the 30 Years' War. Calvinism had not been recognized by the peace settlement, and so in Germany, it was only Lutheranism that was recognized, and so Calvinism was on the out, and many people began to persecute Calvinists. It wasn't just Protestantism across the board, it was Lutheranism or Catholicism. Now, of course, religion played an important role in the outbreak of the 30 Years' War, because this is really about religious conflict, at least on the surface level. But by the end of the war, it will cease being religious whatsoever. It is really called the last of the religious wars, because it will not be fought, and nor will any wars after this truly be fought in the West for religious reasons. Now, clearly we know this is not the truth now, considering the political climate of the Middle East, which is clearly, in part at least, a religious conflict. Now, all major European powers, except England, became involved and embroiled in this massive war. And for 30 years, Germany was plundered and destroyed, different kingdoms waging war against one another, and all sorts of European political interventions occur that really kind of destroy some of the context and peace that had emerged throughout Europe. Now, it ultimately resulted in the Peace of Westphalia, which officially ended the war in Germany in 1648, and had made several alterations to the religious landscape and political landscape. So the Peace of Westphalia stated that all German states, including the Calvinist ones, could determine their own religion. That was ultimately the goal here, is that ultimately you could determine your own religion as long as really it was within Christianity in general. And this really brought an end to the concept of the Holy Roman Empire as a political entity. The Holy Roman Empire had been a confederation of different smaller principalities controlled by one emperor. But this is really dissolved and eradicated at the end of this conflict. And we begin to see true independent nations begin to emerge as they are taking on their own religious and cultural identity in their own territories. Now, this is not, of course, the emergence of true nationalism and nationalistic states, but this is heading toward that direction. Also, of course, England is not free from this age of revolution and warfare. A series of rebellions and civil wars really rocked Europe in the 17th century, the 1600s, and the most famous of which was the English Revolution, a struggle between king and parliament to determine what role each should play. Really a conflict over who had what power, because England had somewhat become a limited monarchy, that the king certainly did not have as much authority as he might desire. And you also have a strong parliament that insists that it has the power to control the territory and the kingdom. And so the Civil War is really over the destiny of who gets to decide what is the nation going to be like. Now, the Stuart line really will inevitably take hold. The Stuart line of rulers began with the ascension to the throne of Elizabeth's cousin, the King of Scots, who became James I of England. Now, of course, the Stuart line is the one that immediately comes into power after Elizabeth, because Elizabeth never married and she died single, and so that was the end of that Tudor line. And so we end up seeing then the Stuart line taking over under James I here depicted. Now, Parliament did not think much of the divine right of kings. They did not think much of the idea that that the king needed to be derived directly from the power of God. And the idea of divine right of kingship was a great tool for the king, because he believed he ruled the nation for God as God's representative. And if you believe God then was all-powerful and all-authoritative, then, of course, the king was all-powerful and all-authoritative. But here, Parliament's going to belittle or demean that idea because, of course, this weakens their own power. And of course, James I, being a king, and a new king at that, is going to fervently believe in the divine right of kingship. Now, part of the conflict will emerge that the Puritans did not like the king's strong defense of the Church of England, the Anglican Church, and will really demand that people follow this. Now, the Puritans were a Calvinist-influenced group that were very different than the Anglicans, and inevitably will seek to free themselves from the Anglican context that is emerging in the rule of James I and his insistence and fervence that people conform to the religious authority that he has. Now, the Puritan gentry formed an important part of the House of Commons, that is, the lower part of that Parliament. And the conflict that began during the reign of James came to a head during the reign of his son, Charles I. This is really where the conflict between the Puritans and the Anglican authority, now residing in Charles I, really comes to a head. Charles also tried to impose more ritual on the Church of England, which, of course, is not something that the Puritans are going to find favorable, because the Catholic context is a very ritual-dense expression of faith. And when the Calvinists begin to see that the Anglicans are being influenced by that, you'll get a notion that maybe they're becoming more like their Catholic brothers again. And this will lead to conflict, of course, for the Puritan gentry and the Puritan voice, which leads to conflict. A civil war emerged, really an explosion between the supporters of the king, which were known as the Cavaliers, and the parliamentary forces, known as the Roundheads. And they were called the Roundheads because of their short hair, which made them, I guess, their heads appear more round, versus the long locks that seemed to be more elite. Now, the person who ends up coming to power through this is Oliver Cromwell. He is a military genius, no question, took control of the Parliament, and purged members who did not support him in a brutal fashion. Of course, one method by which to get rid of your political opponents. And inevitably, Charles I was executed in 1649, and you see that end of the Stuart line there. And so, of course, the Tudor and Stuart line didn't last for very long, with the rise of Cromwell's England. Now, Parliament then abolished the monarchy in the House of Lords, and you see a complete shift in the political context that begins to emerge in England. So really, after Cromwell destroys both king and parliament, Cromwell sets himself up as a military dictatorship, which is a trend that will emerge in Europe and inevitably will become quite popular. Many people are going to see this as hugely problematic because a military dictatorship has no divine right of kingship. And this was one of the first steps toward ending the concept of the divine right of kingship, that by getting rid of and even killing the divine king that supposedly was given authority by God and establishing your own authority really was kind of a signal to saying, God doesn't really have the back of this family. It all starts to become all political and all through might and power. And so this is a major shift that begins to emerge for the English political consciousness and the way that they begin to see things. Now, Cromwell ruled until his death in 1658, which leaves a question. What are you going to do? What's going to happen next? Now, Parliament restored the monarchy after his death, which really shows how they really felt and what they wanted. And to some extent, maybe they could control a monarch a bit more than they could a dictator. And so Parliament restored the monarchy in the person of Charles II, whom was the son of Charles I, the Tudor. The Stuart line, rather. And so the Stuart monarchy gained back its power. But things become problematic again, because under James II, made king in 1685, he was a devout Catholic. And so the Stuart line inevitably shifts back to some Catholicism, which of course is going to be unsettling for Parliament in general. And this is going to make them want to find another voice that is more Protestant. And here, inevitably, we have a problem because under James II and under Charles II and under Charles I and those kings who have come before, Elizabeth and the Tudors, we saw a Protestant trajectory that was emerging in England. And indeed, Anglicanism was the Church of England. But with this shift back to Catholicism, Parliament will really feel uncomfortable about this idea. And so, inevitably, what emerges is a desire to overthrow this king. And this is known as the Glorious Revolution. Parliament invited the Dutch leader, William of Orange, a Protestant leader who had a connection, not through his own blood, but through his marriage, to the throne of England. And so this person will be more palatable to the English temperament, but also someone they feel that they'll be able to control a lot more. And so with almost no bloodshed, he inevitably crosses the English Channel and takes England away and becomes the king, hence the Glorious Revolution. No major battle, no major bloodshed, just seizes authority. Now, a Bill of Rights was created which helped fashion a system of government based on the rule of law and a freely elected parliament, as we set a trajectory away from the divine right of kingship, which, of course, kicking out a king and establishing another king is a huge signal that divine right of kingship is over. And so here we see this Bill of Rights really putting that final nail. So the objectives were, 1, explain how the 30 Years' War ended the unity of the Holy Roman Empire. And 2nd, relate how the democratic ideals were strengthened as a result of the English and Glorious Revolutions.